Hello, and welcome to this program. Today, we talk about a very delicate topic, the new catechism of the Catholic Church, because there is a new book that was written by Michael Haynes, and the book is A Catechism of Errors. So the title already say a lot to you, and we want to discuss about this book with the author, that is Michael Haynes. So thank you for your participation. And also with the theology professor Eduardo Echevarria, that is already our guest for many times, always very welcome. So thank you, Professor Echevarria.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
first of all, I want to start with the writer of the book, Michael Haynes. So I want to ask you why you you have the idea of writing such a book, because it seems very controversial indeed. When I met you exactly because of this book, I saw the title of your book somewhere, and so I contacted you in Twitter, I think, and I say, oh, we may discuss about this because I think is quite controversial. So please tell me what is the aim of this book.
I think well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me on. You're not wrong. It's certainly controversial. I know it. I think the aim is to try and reawaken or instigate a discussion about the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because I know during the course of my own education, people who I've come across who've been, very devotedly attached to the tradition of the Church have always expressed concerns about the Catechism of the Catholic Church. They always pointed me back to traditional catechisms, say like the Baltimore Catechism or Catechism of Trent. And so I studied the Catechism of the Catholic Church during my university, and it was a project I decided on with a good priest friend of mine at the time, who was doing an examination of modern theology and modernisms which had crept into elements of the Church. He's doing at the moment an examination of Vatican II and the documents, but he and I sort of decided on this this topic really, and when I got stuck in to examine the actual book, I compared it back with older catechisms, Baltimore Catechism especially, which is it's spread throughout much of the English-speaking world as just being a go-to manual. I became more and more worried by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because despite its quite hefty size in comparison to some of the older texts, all that wordage left the reader often with a very confused outlook on certain crucial aspects of the Church, particularly, say, with regard to morality, or even, say, I think one fundamental aspect of the New Catechism is its outlook on ecumenism, and how that then shapes the treatment of the rest of the Church and of the rest of the Church's life. So I decided that it was quite important to actually initiate somewhat of a discussion about the Catechism of the Catholic Church, not to say that every single word in there is bad, because as I noted myself, there's some actually lovely sections in the Catechism, but there's also some very troubling sections. And there's a little analogy I only kind of came to me last night, that if you're giving someone a cake or something, you can't really say, oh, well, it's, a lot of it, that bit's okay, that bit's got some poison in which might, affect you in teenage years or later adult life, but don't worry about it. You're going to, if you're a parent, you're going to say, well, hang on, let's not give the child that cake then. And that's the position, I think, with the New Catechism. There are some bits in it which are quite troubling, and if you're not really looking out for them, then you're not going to notice them, but they are still going to affect you, and I think they're going to affect your understanding.
Thank you. I want to Of course, we will look at this troubling section soon, but I want to go to Professor Echevarria, and I ask him to be present at this program, and I submit him the book, and so I want to know what is a general impression, please.
Well, my general impression, just to jump straight into it, I have serious problems with his Michael's whole methodology. For instance, the 1985 synod that was organized by John Paul II, which dealt with the reception of the Second Vatican Council, the council, or that synod, actually stipulated several principles for interpreting Vatican II documents. And remember, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is considered a catechism of the Second Vatican Council. Those principles are not discussed in this book, or in the let us say in the methodological sections of this book. So, for instance, the first principle is that the theological interpretation of the conciliar doctrine must show attention to all the documents in themselves and in their close interrelationship in such a way that the integral meaning of the council's affirmations, often very complex, it admits, might be understood and expressed. It goes on, you have to take into consideration the four constitutions, which have a priority for interpreting the other documents, and so on and so on. That's for me, that's one of the most important things, that the methodology. I also have a problem with there's no real discussion of doctrinal development. I don't see any reason. Well, let's put it this way: why should we take as normative, the Catechism of the Council of Trent, or even the Baltimore Catechism, which is a local catechism, not a universal catechism? To me, that demonstrates also a problem, for instance, with respect to ecumenism. Mortalium Animus of Pius XI rejects ecumenism. The Second Vatican Council, in the Decree on Ecumenism, affirms ecumenism. John Paul II, 20 years later, in Ut Unum Sint, affirms ecumenism. Is there just a contradiction there? I would argue against that. I think that everything that Mortalium Animus rejects about, remember, you have to look at this in its historical context. Everything that Mortalium Animus rejects, for instance, an ecclesiological relativism, or the branch theory of Christianity, or taking diversity as if somehow unity has to come out of ecclesial diversity. I think there's a way to show that there's continuity and at the same time development, because the church continues to, yes, there's a teaching church. I've said this before on these, there's a teaching church, but there's also a listening church. I reject Michael's reading of Vatican II's ecclesiology, or the Catechism's ecclesiology. The church rejects ecclesiological relativism, or a multiple subsistence ecclesiology. Anyway, so we can get into very specific things, but again, I just think that there's a lot of problems, even in the last chapter where there's a discussion about continuity. It just seems to me, Michael, I don't see any real discussion of the for instance, Ratzinger's his address, or Benedict's address on hermeneutics of reform and renewal. And I think the problem is the methodology, the hermeneutics, as it were, of the Second Vatican Council, which of course also affects his reading and interpretation of the Catechism. Chiefly, for instance, he keeps talking as if somehow the Council, Lumen Gentium, the Decree on Ecumenism, etc., accepts an ecclesiological relativism where the Catholic Church is just one among many churches, as if when it says that the church, here too, there's no reflection on the literature regarding the whole understanding of subsistence, and why you didn't even have to look very far. Just look at Ratzinger's when he was the prefect of the CDF and was critical of Leonardo Boff's interpretation of Lumen Gentium 8 as affirming a multiple subsistence ecclesiology, in other words, an ecclesiological relativism.
But Professor, sorry, before I give the word to Michael, that of course want to reply to what is your criticism, that of course is fully licit, and but my point is that indeed the question of subsisted in is not a question that is trivial, because that because he give I mean a very give a lot of reason for discussion, and it is also true that if you say the true church is the Catholic Church, or you say the true church subsists in is not exactly the same thing. So that indeed I also find it at least questionable, because the use of words is a little
I agree with that. But I think Ratzinger himself gave a very clear answer. On the one hand, the term subsisted in refers to the fact that the church that Christ founded exists in its own right as a concrete subject in the Catholic Church. That's not denied. So talking the difference between subsisted in and est is simply a way of trying to account for ecclesial division in the church. So that when the church, when Lumen Gentium then goes on to say that there are elements of truth and sanctification that exist outside the visible boundaries of the church, that doesn't mean that the church now thinks that the church that Christ founded subsists elsewhere, because subsistence has to do with existing in its own right alone. It's a matter of as a concrete subject. It seems to me that the dilemma that has to be avoided is, on the one hand, to affirm what seems to me arguably the church still affirms, and that is that the church that Christ founded subsists in its own right alone in the Catholic Church, but that doesn't mean that outside the visible boundaries of the church, all you have is an ecclesial wasteland and emptiness. Hence, when the church then goes on to affirm that there are elements of truth and sanctification outside the visible boundaries of the church, that doesn't mean that the church now affirms a multiple subsistence ecclesiology.
Professor, but you know better than me that also the father of the church affirmed that outside the boundaries of Catholic Church there are the how do you call it, the seed of the verb? I don't know if you call it in English. Yes,
right.
The seeds of the verb. Yeah. But
that's something entirely different. It seems to me. That's something entirely different, because when it talks about that, that's in the context of talking about, like in the Acts of the Apostles, where Luke says that God has not left himself without witness. God has not left himself without witness, Or when we read, there's a general revelation of God in and through the works of creation. We read that in Romans 1. So those are not general revelation is not a saving revelation. It's simply talking about how in Romans 1 and in Romans 2, I can go and read, a religious text, even for instance, Islamic text, and there can be fragments of truth there. That doesn't mean that those fragments of truth are salvific. There's a special revelation which is historical, it's verbal, and that's salvific. That's
and that is in the Catholic Church.
In the Catholic Church, of course,
Yeah.
because even those elements of truth and sanctification that are, if you read at the end in paragraph 17 of Lumen Gentium, paragraph 16 ends with the call to evangelize, and so paragraph 17 goes on to talk expressly about dealing with those fragments of truth. You're trying to. They have to be seen in the context of Christ. But to me, what's important is, and look, I'm not saying that there aren't honest questions deserve honest answers, and I take Michael to be asking honest questions. I just disagree with his whole approach to the Catechism and his whole approach to the Second Vatican Council, because at the end of the day, it seems to me his methodology is flawed.
Okay, so we listen to Michael Lagarfort. So you want to reply, please?
I think the dangers which I found were in the text were the ways in which the church described itself. You mentioned obviously the whole controversy and debate about the use of the phrase "subsists in," as opposed to just sort of plain and simple "is" or "est." And then there's I just have a text in front of me. There's there's passages where the church is the Catechism, is describing using other ecclesial communities as a means of salvation. And you touched on that, how you'll find elements of truth. Perhaps you'll find some things can lead souls to God. They can lead souls to the Catholic Church. But the way the Church is described in the New Catechism, it seems to be in a very conciliatory tone, not relating to the Council, of course, but just almost trying to be somewhat ashamed of its nature in the way it then tries to relate to other religions, trying to sort of relinquish some of its authority, which was more.
Protestantism is not another religion. We're not talking about, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Reformed. That's not another religion.
What I found interesting was, the way the Church tries to equate itself with Protestantism. The Catholic Church tries to, in the new Catechism, the Catholic Church is seen almost as being just sort of one of a family with Protestantism, and there's not really much difference between us, and it doesn't really matter into which, whether you're Catholic or whether you're Protestant. When I examined the texts going through, I was left with that very strong feeling that it's removing the authority of the Catholic Church, which was so present in historical manuals or catechisms. And I know we can't refer it or compare it to the Baltimore, in the sense that the Baltimore is the universal standard to which everything must be aligned with. But then, in the same way, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is described by John Paul II as not being something to replace the local catechisms, but the ideology and the methodology promoted in the New Catechism has done just that. It seemed to replace the traditional understanding of the Church, traditional ecclesiology, and traditional understanding of the nature of how Catholics should relate to others and how we should actually attempt to spread the faith or not. And some of the passages in the New Catechism, they seem to set the seeds for what we're now seeing being fulfilled more recently, when we have sort of comments coming from the Vatican about not bothering to try and evangelize peoples, because there's not really much of a need if we're all one family and we're sort of all together in the same religion, and we're just trying to amalgamate and find something that we can all pray about together and hold hands. I think that's what we're seeing that now currently, and I think the seeds of that current how should I describe it? The seeds of those current statements are really found in the Catechism. I think they are, what we're seeing now is the natural progression of what was contained in the Catechism.
Professor, before your reply, can I say something that probably relate to what also Michael was saying? So you don't think that also these last 8 years also make more and more people under the impression that like you know that the present Pope say, oh, proselytism is not a good thing. So don't you think that the impression from this pontificate probably amplify some issues that may come from the ecumenism or the way it is perceived? Please.
Well, look, I've written a large book on Pope Francis and the legacy of Vatican II. I don't consider Pope Francis to be the fulfillment, as it were, of Vatican II. I think there are many things that he just, in many ways, I think just betrays. So when I listen, even Fratelli Tutti, I wrote about this. It just seems to me there are many things in Pope Francis that I just think are not really rooted in the Second Vatican Council. Just to take as an example, I mean, his understanding of ecumenism sometimes suggests the idea that you have ecclesial diversity, and out of that diversity, you're going to get unity. But it seems to me that's exactly the opposite of what Vatican II talks about regarding ecumenism. And that's precisely because, as I said earlier, the church that Christ founded subsists in its own right alone in the Catholic Church, in a concrete church. There's an ecclesiological particularity there. And so Catholic ecumenism begins with the presupposition that there already is a one church. It doesn't begin with the assumption that we have to derive unity out of diversity. The Pope, I think Francis sometimes suggests that. There are all kinds of problems. I discussed that at length in my book, Pope Francis and the Legacy of Vatican II, even with respect to the moral life. And he very rarely, until recently, he very rarely discusses the commandments. And part 3 of the Catechism has, how many paragraphs on the 10 commandments and the implications from each of those commandments. So honestly, I disagree fundamentally with the idea that somehow the seeds of what we find in Francis are sown in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I mean, as I say, that's a long conversation, and I carry that out in my book on Pope Francis. I do not agree with Michael's interpretation of Vatican II ecclesiology. I don't agree with his reading of ecumenism. And I don't agree with his understanding of interreligious dialogue. I think both interreligious dialogue is a truth-oriented dialogue. You can find that in the Catechism, also in the writings of John Paul II. I think all of that is neglected, and much of the literature that has arisen to discuss these things. The Catechism isn't perfect. It doesn't say everything that needs to be said. Ratzinger himself, Benedict himself, said at one of his last addresses, he said that Nostra Aetate, while a seminal document, he says, regarding the relationship between the church and non-Christian religions, he's not talking about non-Catholics, he's talking about non-Christians. He says one of the limitations is a better word in Nostra Aetate is its overwhelmingly positive approach to these other religions. When Ratzinger himself in Introduction to Christianity and his book on Truth and Tolerance, and in many other places, he makes very clear that we have to be critical of other religions. And there comes a point, he says, where you have to give an account. You have to say why. When you have to give an account, when you have to say why I'm not a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Muslim, and so on, that's going to involve you in dealing with the conflict. Because there is a conflict between the religions. There's a conflict of truth claims. If you're Catholic, if you're a Christian, you can't think that Islam is true. Because Islam denies the deity of Christ, it denies the incarnation, it denies the atoning work of Christ, that Christ died on the cross, it denies the resurrection, etc. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't elements of truth there, because Islam affirms a theology of creation, and even it's monotheistic. But even there, as you begin to probe their monotheism, you know that they're Unitarians, so they can't really account for unity and diversity in the Godhead. All of these things. I would have liked it if there had been some discussion of the literature and more explicitly the methodology. It seems to me Michael has no regard for the church being a listening church, at the same time being a teaching church. It cannot be that, and again, I've argued this in many places, Mortalium Animus of Pius XI, it seems to me, I don't take it to be normative in the sense that it's somehow the decree in ecumenism is somehow wrong because Mortalium Animus of Pius XI didn't accept ecumenism. I think there's a historical context there. Pius XI, as I said before, everything that Pius XI rejected about ecumenism, ecclesiological relativism, the branch theory of Christianity, I don't understand how Michael could say that Vatican II says it doesn't matter whether you're Catholic. I find that preposterous, to be honest. But everything that Mortalium Animus rejects, the decree in ecumenism rejects. But if you look at it in its historical context, Pius XI understood his understanding humanism was one-sided. He never asked, how should we stand John 17? What should we make of ecumenism? How do we understand? Also, it seems to me that anybody who says what Michael says about non-Catholics, I'd like to know what non-Catholics he's read. Has he read Calvin? Has he read Luther? Has he read, in more contemporary times, Karl Barth? Has he read Berkhauer, Bavinck, et cetera, et cetera? Has he read even John Webster? I don't see how anybody could think that there aren't elements of truth and sanctification, or even as the decree in ecumenism says, that I used to tell my students, I remember my students, seminarians, in a class once I was teaching on Introduction to Christian Spirituality, and I had them, aside from some other books that they were required to read, like St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life, I had them read a book by John Webster, who was an evangelical Anglican, his book on holiness. And I could hear the little grumbling in the class, because I was asking them to read an evangelical Anglican. And I said to them, you have no problem reading pagans like Aristotle and Plato, but you have a problem reading a committed Christian. So then at that point, I started reading to them from the decree in ecumenism, where it says that after having affirmed that the Catholic Church, has been endowed with all divinely revealed truth and with all means of grace, and so on and so on. So the fullness of the means of salvation are contained in the Catholic Church. It goes on to say, on the other hand, Catholics must joyfully acknowledge and esteem the truly Christian endowment from our common heritage, which are to be, recognized in our separated brethren. I don't know why I would use the word separated if what Michael is saying is true. It is right and salutary to recognize and virtuous works in the lives of others who are bearing witness to Christ, sometimes even to the shedding of their blood. Someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Nor should we forget that whatever is wrought by the grace of the Holy Spirit in the hearts of our separated brethren can contribute to our own edification. I think that these non-Catholic separated brethren have contributed to my own edification. If you go back and you read the Decree on Ecumenism in paragraph 17, where it distinguishes between doctrinal truths and their formulations, it goes on to say that we're not surprised if one tradition or another has a deeper appreciation of some aspect of the revealed mystery that we share. It's been that tradition, in my own case, the Reformed tradition has a more deep appreciation, for instance, of the Lordship of Christ. We share the Lordship of Christ. We have a solemnity on Christ's Lordship. But I think the Decree on Ecumenism is saying that there are some traditions, some Christian traditions, that have a deeper appreciation of some aspect of the revealed mystery. They've been able to give they're more articulate. Now, of course, that alternative formulation has to be consistent with Catholic theology. It can't conflict with Catholic theology, but if it's consistent with Catholic theology, it brings about a fuller understanding of the Christian life and Christian truth and so on. I see no reason to deny any of that.
Because you said many things. Of course, I think Michael want to also say something about your reply, and of course I'm sure that Michael know that he wrote a book that is controversial, and of course the reaction can be also very strong against or in favor of the book, of course. So Michael, please.
Firstly, apologies. My internet just dropped for a few moments, so if I disappeared, I missed a couple of moments of what you were saying, Professor. But I just tried to sort of gather it all in my head. The trouble I have, I think you noted a point there at the end where you were saying how others will have sort of a more clear or a more profound understanding of truths of the Catholic Church. I would have an issue with that because Christ founded the Catholic Church, and he promised that she was the rock. We would have a church which would not err on matters of faith and morals, and to have someone, say a Protestant or a Muslim, who is professing
I didn't say a Muslim. We're talking Christians.
Okay.
Ecumenism.
Okay. But I think even then to have Christians proposing more of a profound understanding of the Catholic Church's truths, which have been taught for centuries, and then to suddenly have in the last 50 years documents and arguments which say that whilst we've had the truth taught for so many centuries, we now have to listen to others not in the church in order to understand ourselves and to understand these truths. I think that becomes very problematic, especially for young people growing up or for converts who are entering the church, because they're then taught that the church perhaps might not have everything exactly right, or might not be doing things entirely correctly, or perhaps she could change if she's done, if the church has made a mistake in the past, or we have to listen to others. And the danger is, I think, with that aspect, where do you then draw the line? Because I think now, again, I know you disagreed with this point, but I think some seeds in the Catechism and in other documents are now coming to fruition currently, where we're seeing that we have to listen to those, say, the elements of the divorced and remarried being admitted to communion. I think if you start a process whereby you start to form church doctrine or mold church doctrine using the ideas of those who are not in the Catholic Church, then you end up where we are with the current synod of synodality, where the Church is sort of experiencing how it is to be the Catholic Church by listening to those on the peripheries, and it says in the preparatory documents, by listening to those who are perhaps not Catholics or no longer Catholics. I think that has come from the passages which are contained here. When you emphasize an idea of charity, which is not based so much on love of God first and foremost, but love of neighbor first and foremost, which is, I think, a crucial distinction. When you emphasize that slightly different warped idea of charity instead of faith as the chief sign of unity, then it becomes quite easy to become a church of almost complete listening, forgetting that you have to teach and spread the faith. And that, I think, is one of the greatest inherent dangers that I found in the Catechism, that the texts are put forward in such a way as to just subtly undermine the faith one has in the unchangeability of the Catholic Church, in the solid foundations of unchanging doctrine. And it leads you to question things that you've been taught, or question things that you believe, because others, say other Christians, others outside the church, are saying some things which then the Catechism is saying that you have to listen to them, and we have to try and sort of reach out, be united in charity, when we should be united in faith. And even that aspect of being united in faith, the Catechism seem, and I suppose much of more recent ideas of ecumenism, seem to promote the unity rather than faith-giving unity. So they seem to, I think this is here in the Catechism, unity is promoted by trying to find a common ground, and by dropping or just polishing off those aspects which seem problematic. So you avoid, I mean, I know my own sort of love of co-redemption, Marian co-redemption, was an issue which was avoided at the Second Vatican Council in order to avoid creating problems in ecumenical dialogue in the future. And I think this is what's very clear in the Catechism, that in order to push this modern idea of ecumenism, it's shying away from awkward passages or problematic passages which could create sticking points for many in the world, or many Christians. And I found that in say in areas of how the Catechism teaches on morality as well. It seems to, in creating, I think, in looking for a common ground, in creating this idea of unity, it refers morality to man before God. So it seems to refer sin or a good or bad society. It defines those insofar as they relate to humanity, rather than insofar as how they relate to God or to his law. So that I think is one of the greatest. It's subtle dangers. It's very, very subtle. It's just gradual. But if you leave it unchecked, if you leave it unquestioned, you then end up on a very, very different track, which I think is quite visible currently.
Can I, Professor, can I introduce your reply with my tentative interpretation of what you are trying to say? Because you are my guest also for other programs, so I heard your and for what I can understand of your points, you say, oh, we have we have Vatican II and the documents of Vatican II. We have the current situation, but the two things are not per se related. So it means the current situation is not to be interpreted as a consequence of the documents of Vatican II, but indeed is in some sense also a corruption of what Vatican II wanted to say. So this is, I think, what is your fighting point. I'm correct?
Yes, I would certainly argue, and I do that again in many of my writings, but even in the text on Pope Francis and the legacy of Vatican II, the reception of Vatican II, it seems to me, has been mixed, and in some respects even corrupted. So, for instance, just to start with Michael's last point, the Catechism, Part 3 of the Catechism, begins with, what is the chief end of man? What is the chief end of man? To use the first, the chief end of man, of course, is to love God above all things. The central commandment of love, to love God above all things. To enter into a relationship with the Trinity, beatitude, it says. The context then that follows is the question of virtues, the relationship between, the life of virtues, the supernatural and the natural virtues. And in the context of the chief end of man, where then the whole business about the central commandment of love, to love God above all things and to love your neighbor as yourself, we then go to the virtues, both the natural and the supernatural virtues. The natural virtues are grounded in the theological virtues, or supernatural virtues of faith, hope, and charity. It's in that context then that the whole question of the commandments, the 10 commandments, which the natural moral law, all of those three aspects are integral to the understanding of the Christian moral life. When the Catechism talks about the dignity of man, it doesn't make man's dignity the chief end of man. The chief end of man is to love God, to enter into the life of the Trinity. There's no difference there with the Baltimore Catechism, which said that in answer to the question, what is the chief end of man, is to love God, to love God in this life and to be forever with him in the next. It seems to me that that's exactly what the Catechism says in those sections that precede the discussion of the virtues, and then those many paragraphs that discuss the commandment. So it just seems to me to be, in my view, a mistaken reading to somehow think that the Catechism is sort of a humanist-centered or man-centered or anything of that sort. The other thing is, I have a chapter in my Francis book on chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, and it's a critique of Amoris Laetitia. But I don't think that more generally, I said a moment ago, the decree in ecumenism in paragraph 17, it makes that distinction. Looking back to John the 23rd's opening address at Vatican II, where he distinguishes between, dogmatic truths and their formulations, and then there's the subordinate clause where he says there that the formulation, the alternative formulation, has to keep the same meaning and the same judgment of truth. John the 23rd is looking back to the First Vatican Council, and the First Vatican, in making that distinction, and the First Vatican Council is citing Vincent of Lorenz, the 5th century monk from the Communitorium of Vincent, where Vincent asks the question, is there no progress in religion? And he goes on to distinguish progress from change. Change is when one thing becomes something else. Change, for instance, would have been if the Second Vatican Council's ecclesiology became an ecclesiological relativism, where the Catholic Church is just one among many churches. I don't think that's true. The Church does not subscribe to a multiple subsistence ecclesiology. The Church that Christ founded subsists in its own right alone in the Catholic Church, in a concrete church. That's why you have ecclesiological particularity. Why that ecclesiological particularity provokes opposition among Protestants to Catholicism. Having made that distinction, the church does not, there's no change in that respect. There's development, and development has to do with continuity. But the other thing is, it seems to me, here it says again, what has already been said about legitimate variety, we are pleased to apply to differences in theological expressions of doctrine. In the investigation of revealed truth, here it's talking about the Orthodox Church, but I think this approach can be applied. I've applied it to Reformed churches. It is hardly surprising, it says, if sometimes one tradition has come nearer than the other to an apt appreciation of certain aspects of a revealed mystery. That doesn't mean that they're telling us something new. We, as I said earlier, here I'm sitting in one of libraries in my house, and there are 3 volumes of the Dutch theologian intellectual of the 19th century and early 20th century, Abraham Kuyper, who was a Dutch neo-Calvinist, who wrote a 3-volume work on the Lordship of Christ. Am I to think that there's absolutely nothing to learn from Kuyper on the Lordship of Christ? We share that conviction that Christ is Lord. Kuyper, it seems to me, has come nearer than the other to an apt appreciation of certain aspects of a real mystery, or has expressed them in a clearer manner. As a result, Lumen Gentium, the Decree on Ecumenism says, these various theological formulations are often to be considered as complementary rather than conflicting. If they're conflicting, then of course they're contradictory, and so we're not going to accept what, let us say, Kuyper has written about the Lordship of Christ. But they can be complementary, and that's why in the end it says that these complementary formulations are directed toward a right ordering of life, indeed toward a full contemplation of Christian truth. I don't see any reason. I can't believe that we want to say that we can't learn anything from non-Christians. Sorry, non-Catholics rather, since we're talking about ecumenism. I don't understand how we can say that there's nothing to learn there.
But Professor, can I, and of course I will go to Michael, but I want to touch with you on if you can briefly tell me if you agree with me or disagree. You make that important distinction of the inaugural address by John 23 from development to change. Okay, so for example, we touch on the liturgy. Now you would tell me that in the liturgy there was no change instead of development. So I would question this because
remember, the distinction even there that's drawn is between certain immutable elements, unchangeable elements, and certain elements that can be changed.
Yes, but the liturgy as we have in the average churches in your country, because I visit your country, so I saw some of the liturgies there in my country, and in other country it seems something completely different from what was before. I'm a musician. I mean, the music, sure. it was destroyed.
Sure. Absolutely. So, but that doesn't mean that I would agree. The reception of Vatican II, the reception of Sacrosanctum Concilium, we can make all kinds of arguments against its reception. And many people have, Aidan Nichols and many others have.
But you remember, because you study Vatican II, that one of the main liturgists in Vatican II, that was Aimé Martimor, the French liturgy, he say of the liturgy, that the liturgy coming from Vatican II was a new creation. So he also admitted that it was not something that organically developed from what was the ancient rite or whatever you want to call it, but it was a new creation, was a new thing. So this would in a certain way go against what John 23 saw about development and not change, because in the liturgy that is culminate fonts of our Christian life, there was a very big change, and we can all see this change. Then we can interpret the change differently, but I mean that if you go to a Tridentine Mass, it is, you can see how the Mass was before Vatican II, and if you go to the next parish, you have almost another rite.
Right, but let me just tell you, I don't think John the 23rd is not talking as in particular about the liturgy there, and nor does he even make the distinction between development and change. It's simply that that what he quotes there is referring us back to Vatican I, where Vatican I quotes from Vincent of Lorentz, the 5th century monk, and it's the 5th century monk, Vincent of Lorentz, who then asks the question whether there's a difference between progress and change. Is there no progress in religion? And he says, yes, there is. And he argues that change is when one thing becomes something else. Well, even with respect, and I'm not a liturgist, but even with respect to the liturgy, it seems to me that one can argue that the unchangeability, that the liturgy is about the redeeming acts of God in Christ. When it says that the liturgy is the source and summit of the Christian life, why is that so? Because it's the deepest point of entry into the mysteries of salvation. And so it's about the redeeming acts of God in Christ. It seems to me that that's, as far as I know, I mean, even when you go to a church, a Catholic church, where you can, you go into a Catholic church, the architecture, it's
horrible.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's horrible. I want to go into a church, I'm always thinking in terms of Hebrews 11, I want to go into the church where I'm going to be surrounded by the cloud of witnesses, the saints and so on. Well, obviously, many Catholic churches don't have that. But to me, when you get to the Eucharistic mystery about the redeeming acts of God in Christ, well, unless maybe you have priests that even deny that, but it seems to me that Sacrosanctum Concilium doesn't deny that. Ratzinger's The Spirit of the Liturgy makes very clear that the Mass is about God. The Mass is about revelation. The Mass is revelation in that sense. So it seems to me, if that's unchangeable, whatever else, and again, I'm not a liturgist, but Vincent of Lorentz asks an important question. There's a difference between progress and change. And when you have development, a deepening of our understanding, unless we think that we have nothing more to learn, which is, the fact is, if you just think about this for a moment, even at the Vatican II, there was no discussion about in Gaudium et Spes, the beautiful sections on marriage. I also disagree with Michael's reading about that there's a discontinuity there because of the primary and secondary ends. Again, that's a whole other conversation. But the fact is, even though those sections in Gaudium et Spes on marriage are great sections, they never considered the question, because nobody was discussing at that point whether 2 men or 2 women could be married. So now there's the discussion of that question. John Paul II, in my judgment, in his Theology of the Body, in part 2 of the Theology of the Body, in the sections on the nature of the sacrament of marriage, has reflected, it seems to me, profoundly and brilliantly, on the nature of the validity of the sacrament of marriage and how the sacrament of marriage requires sexual differentiation, sexual difference as a fundamental prerequisite for the two to become one flesh. So you have an anthropology there that he develops in the context of discussing the validity of the sacrament of marriage, so that when it has to be, there can never be a time when the church would accept same-sex marriage, precisely because of what Jesus says in the Gospel of Mark. When he's asked about divorce, he refers us back to Genesis 1:27. God created man in his image, male and female he created him. And then it says, Jesus quotes Genesis 2:24, therefore a man shall leave his mother and his father, cleave unto his wife, and the two, which two? Male and female, shall become one flesh. So not only is marriage about permanence, it's about two-ness, male and female two-ness. It's about sexual differentiation being a fundamental prerequisite for the two to become one flesh. If same-sex marriage, as some, people, theologians, even bishops in Germany, that would be a change. That wouldn't be a development. That wouldn't be a development in the churches. But my point is that there are times when you have to address you in the light of the determinate bounds of dogma, says Vincent de Lorenz, it has the same meaning and the same judgment of truth about marriage. So you're going to deepen your understanding within these determinate boundaries. And the determinate boundaries, there's a conceptual, dogmatic hardcore that remains the same. Sexual differentiation is a fundamental prerequisite for the two to become one flesh. You can continue to deepen your understanding of what marriage is, and I think John Paul II in the Theology of the Body has done that, such that now it's very clear that marriage is not about love as such. Love may be the dynamic behind marriage, but when a man says to a woman, I take you as my wife, or more generally, I take you as my spouse, that has to correspond to sexual difference, bodily sexual difference. Otherwise, you can't have a valid sacrament. So it seems to me John Paul II's reflections on anthropology is addressing the challenge that has been raised by those people who want to change the church's teaching on what marriage is. So
thank you. Sorry. I want to, because we are close to the end, and before my last question to Michael, I want to show that we are in Ritorna Itaca, in YouTube, Ritorna Itaca. We are in Twitter, Aurelio Porfiri. We are in fan page, the Aurelio Porfiri, myself, in Facebook. If you want to be updated, go on Telegram and find my channel, Aurelio Porfiri, where there are all the update articles, video, events, and everything. So, Michael, we are close to the end of this lively debate about your book, A Catechism of Errors, that, of course, being controversial is a reason for a very hot debate, and this is also good. But I want to ask you a question, and if you can reply synthetically, that is this. Did you write this book because of your impression of the documents of Vatican II and the Catechism, or did you write this book under the impression of this pontificate? So my point is how much this pontificate has influenced your decision to write this book?
Gosh, that's a good one. I don't think the pontificate of Pope Francis was the only instigator. I think the confusion that has almost reigned, if you like, during his pontificate has certainly highlighted to me the need to actually have a debate about many of the texts which are being used today. So I think that played a small part, but I think the main reason for writing it was seeing the state of the church separate to Pope Francis, seeing how we have sort of really retrogressed in the last 100 years from, instead of having, churches full, we're having churches which are closing down because no one's coming, and seeing what is the cause of that? What can we do to change that? And when you're having...
Get a new pope.
That would help. That's for sure. But so then I thought, with the if you have families, if you have priests, future priests, religious, who are being formed using a textbook which, to my mind, was full of many dodgy areas, many problematic issues, which are, as we've sort of seen and noted, that we're linking back to the Second Vatican Council. I think it was more a concern about those documents than purely Pope Francis's sections. I have included his own recent change regarding the death penalty, so that we can see more of the more recent actions which Pope Francis is doing. They are very much having an effect on the faith now, but I think this is at its core rooted in issues in perhaps the documents from the Second Vatican Council, or the change in the church which arose from the council.
And I think the topic you raise now, so the topic of death penalty, can be really one issue for another debate, where, of course, I will invite you, both of you, to give your own contribution for this time. I want to thank you for the participation. I think it was a very lively debate, and it was lively because the book of Michael Haynes, A Catechism of Errors, is certainly a controversial book, as he also admit. And so if you want to have an idea, you can, of course, read the book that is available on Amazon and the other store. And Professor Echevarria,
may I just say one thing? Look, I think, as I said at the beginning, honest questions deserve honest answers. So I take Michael's questions to be honest questions, and they deserve an answer. I'm not suggesting that that the Catechism of the Catholic Church doesn't have limitations, but I don't think that there are any errors in it. It seems to me those are two different things. No more, the Council of Trent, its documents didn't say everything that needed to be said about the sacraments, but what it did say was foundational. No, it's just like Chalcedon and Nicaea and so on. I mean, it just seems to me we can continue to deepen our understanding of these documents, what those documents assert, recognizing limitations, because we want to deepen our understanding of these things. And there has to, of course, you have to keep the same meaning and the same judgment. I said, it's not like you want to come and say something that contradicts it. So I just think this is the kind of text that requires a lot of discussion, and I just tried to be as forthright in why I don't agree with it.
Yeah, of course, and that it's okay, because this also gives to Michael the possibility to explain, to clarify what it is his point. So thank you very much again, both of you, and for this very interesting debate. And thank you to everyone that will follow and follow this debate, that will follow it later. So thank you again.
Thank you, Aurelio. Thank you, Michael. Take care. Bye-bye.